doing it. Some there have been less doing it. And so in this missions conference, the question that really needs to be asked is a personal one. Because you do have a role in this. Everybody is involved in the mission. Everybody is supposed to be involved in the mission. There are no bystanders. There's no spectators for believers. And there's a role for you to play. I got saved when I was just a month shy of my 17th birthday, and 2 months shy of my 20th birthday. I was in Fiji 3 years later, and really have remained there since, and was clueless that God would have the particular role that He had for me to play and still play. But it doesn't matter if you are the missionary, if you're the pastor, we're all involved in this somehow. And really the question that I hope you have been asking yourself and that you've been asking the Lord is for Him to clarify to you exactly what He wants you to do. You don't have to do what I do. You don't have to do what somebody else does. But it's a sin for you not to do what the Lord is going to ask of you to do. So we're going to start tonight in the book of Ezra, Old Testament. And I'm sure as what will end up happening is as we share the word of the Lord through the week, I'll probably share a little bit more about me. Only because I've been a missionary. It's what I've done for the last 23 years. And it's going to happen. You're going to hear some of my own stories. I have to tell you, though, that when missionaries tell their stories, we tell about generally the victory. But you should know that long before the victory, there's a lot of battles. There's a lot of ordinary. There's a lot of boring. There's a lot of monotonous. There's even times when you ask yourself, what am I doing? Is this even making a difference? But when we compact 23 years down, we're going to tell you that it did count. It did make a difference. But just don't think when we tell you some of the neat things that it's like that all the time. There's those other times when you're kind of thinking, should I just get on a plane and go home yet? Does the Lord... So anyway, Ezra, the book of Ezra is recording a very important historical event. The kingdom of Judah had been captive. They'd been under Babylonian captivity for about 70 years. And there's now a return back to Jerusalem, and there is a decree that has been given to rebuild the temple. The temple was destroyed. They were taken captive. They're now coming back. And Ezra records two different waves of people who came back to Jerusalem. And when we get, and you read these first 3 chapters, it's really exciting. A lot of people are stirred up, and a lot of people are moved. And a lot of Jews have taken up this task to relocate from what was Babylon, and they're now coming back. And, you know, if you've been 70 years in one place, you got yourself established. You built homes, and you got a life, and you fit into that new, Australia is filled with people who've come from many different parts of the world, and it doesn't take 70 years before you feel like this is home. And I suppose a lot of you like to go back and visit, but you're not planning on going back to stay. This is home. And for these Jews going back to Jerusalem, to a city that no longer really existed. It was there, but it was in ruins. Their temple was destroyed. But there was a lot of excitement in those early moments of going back to rebuild the temple. So we read about how they set up the altar and they began to sacrifice, and then they laid the foundation of the temple, and some they cried and some they wept, and there was joy and excitement about what the Lord was going to do. But when you get to chapter number 4, it says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, then they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers and said unto them, let us build with you. Now I'm not going to read this whole chapter, but basically they are finding ways to stop them from rebuilding the temple. One, they said, hey, let's build this together. But they already learned from previous experience, we're not working with the heathen. We don't get together. We don't want your help and support. And you keep reading, and later they tried to intimidate them, and they tried to distract them. And finally they wrote letters back to accuse them of a rebellion and an insurrection, and reminding what had happened in generations earlier. And when you get to verse 23, it says, now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews, and made them cease by force and power. Then ceased the work of the house of God which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now you do know that the rebuilding of the temple was the will of God. It wasn't just an idea that the Jews came up with. It was part of God's plan. And in fact, it was a miracle of God that Cyrus, the king of Persia, and the Persians had taken over from Babylon, it was a miracle that Cyrus even had it come into his heart to send the Jews back to rebuild their temple. That was a work of God. So this rebuilding of the temple was not, hey guys, I got an idea. Let's go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This was a divinely inspired activity. But you should always know that whenever God commands us to do something, there is opposition to it. Satan never sits back and says, hey, go for it. Satan's always an opposer, is he not? We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, etc. Satan is the ruler of the darkness of this world, and satanic opposition has always been there whenever God's people go into whatever God has called them to do. I'll often hear people say things like, man, the devil's really attacking. And I'm like, and? Like, you're surprised by that? Or you think you're unique to that? You think that he only attacks certain people? No, whenever there's obedience to the will of God, there's always satanic opposition to it. But in this case, the work of building the temple ceased. And it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. And then in chapter 5, it says, then the prophets, Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua the son of Jozadak, and began to build the house of God which was at Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. Do you realize that from the end of chapter 4, when they stopped building the temple, until chapter 5 verse 2, when they start building it again, is between 17 to 19 years later. That's how long the work of God ceased in Jerusalem. And it took these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to show up on the scene, and they began preaching. And you know, we do need preaching. You know, if you think you're going to just stumble along effectively through life without preaching, forget about it. Old Testament, New Testament, there is a plan for preaching. And that's why it's important that you put yourself under good preaching ministries. I've heard people say, I don't really need to go to church. You know, I can read the Bible at home. And I'm like, I hope you can read the Bible at home, and I hope you read the Bible at home. But your personal devotions does not replace preaching. And preaching does not replace your personal devotions. But you got to remember, when you read the Bible at home, you're always reading it through those two eyes that belong to you. You know, I know nobody's biased in here. You're all just full of integrity when you read. Now, how many of you have come to church and God had your number? I mean, the preaching came and you're like, God, how did the preacher know that? And we've all had that experience. So God uses these preachers, Haggai and Zechariah. And by the way, you should probably know, and I'm sure many of you do know, that the Bible is not put together chronologically, because you have to stop at the end of chapter 4 and realize that Haggai and Zechariah preach. So you need to stop there and go to the book of Haggai and Zechariah, which are in those little minor prophets, because they fit right here in this chapter. And there are some things that they said that are extremely important to us. Now, of course, I'm going to be tying all of this into missions. Here we have the Jews that had a mission, if you were. They were to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. We were not rebuilding a physical temple of any kind, but we are building, if you want to think of it that way, a spiritual temple. We are going into the world with the gospel. We are preaching. And as we preach and as people get saved, they become lively stones that build up a temple. Churches are built everywhere where the Spirit of God works in that assembly of people. So we have what we call a Great Commission. We have this go into all the world. We have this go into every creature. And how are we doing at our mission that has been given to us? And we're going to tie these two things together. So if you would, could you just turn to the book of Haggai? I don't know how you pronounce it. Mine is right. Haggai. I read it called Haggai. I call her Haggai or Hagi. In Fiji, we get all kinds of unique ways of pronouncing English words. And I want you to notice, when you stop doing the mission that God gives you, you always got good reasons for it. We never want to just say, you know what, I'm intimidated. I'm backslidden. I'm disobedient. So when Haggai comes along and begins to prophesy, notice in verse number 2. It says, "Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." So what were the people saying? It's not time to build the house of the Lord yet. And how many years had gone by? 17 to 19 years of just the foundation. And what they keep telling themselves is it's not time yet. Well, the time to do it was when the Lord commanded it to be done, and no other time. Why were they not doing it? Well, they had been intimidated by human government, because they had false accusations written up to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes wrote a letter back saying, you need to stop. And what happened at that point was surrender. When the decree came, the people just stopped. And when it comes to the New Testament gospel ministry, do you know how many governments have banned us, believers, from preaching the gospel? How effective would Paul have been if he obeyed all those government decrees not to preach in this city or not to preach in that city? You think we'd be reading about the same missionary journeys? I mean, they took Paul outside the city and stoned him. And you know, when they stoned him, they weren't trying to hurt him, they were killing him. And they stopped throwing stones when they were persuaded that he was dead. Maybe he was dead. Maybe that's when he was caught up to the third heaven. But he was left there, and God restored him, and he went right back into the city. And how many times when Paul was taken, or in the early book of Acts when Peter and John were taken and they said things, did we not straitly command you not to speak in his name? Governments around the world have, in every generation, there's always been some government somewhere that has outlawed preaching. You know, I always thought that my own country, America, was the land of the free. And I was surprised to learn that in the early colonies that they jailed Baptists for preaching. I didn't know that. I thought we were persecuted in all kinds of other countries, but not in the good old United States of America. But we were jailed and imprisoned for not bringing our babies to be baptized or preaching without a license and all those type of things. So when you give in to whatever pressure you give into, because it is uncomfortable to be a witness for Christ in the flesh. If you think becoming a missionary and going to some other country, suddenly you're going to be good at what you're not good at doing here, forget about it. It's always intimidating. I've been doing this for so many years, and still within my flesh, I look at people, I want to give them a tract, I want to witness to them, and I'm still intimidated every single time. And I'm wondering when that feeling is going to leave me. One, because I don't like rejection. I'm a nice guy. I like people to like me. I don't like when people look at me like I've got a disease or something wrong. But you know what? We preachers don't like it either. But what's stopping us? So anyway, their excuse was, it's not time yet. And that's a very good and a very common excuse given by people. Yes, one day I will, but not yet. The Lord's still working on me. I'm not ready yet. I'm not trained enough yet. I'm not this and that. We'll talk about that as time goes along. But then he said, verse 3, then came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses? While this house lieth waste. Now therefore saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. It was time for them to build their own houses in their mind. Not time to build the house of the Lord, but it is time to build my house. Priorities. They had plenty of time for themselves. They had plenty of time to think about their own future, plenty of time to think about their house, plenty of time to think about their life, plenty of time to think about their comfort, but it wasn't time yet to think about the Lord and about the Lord's house. And I'll notice that, as our kids grow up and they're getting into secondary school, it's always time to think about university. Always time. It's always time to think about where you're going to study. It's always time to think about what career you're going to have. It's always time to be planning for that. How are you gonna buy your first house? What are you going to say? We always have the time to think and consider the things that we feel are going to benefit our personal life. But when it comes to the Lord and the mission and the Great Commission, oftentimes we say, it's not time yet. A little bit later, I'll get around to that. And most people really never get around to it. So we're not going to read much more in the book of Haggai. I just wanted to pull that out to you, is that one of the things that Haggai does is to show them the fallacy of what they were spending their time on. But if you go over to the book of Zechariah, it's just the next book over. And you've got two names that are mentioned in these two books quite often. You've got Joshua and you've got Zerubbabel. And Joshua was the religious leader. Zerubbabel was the governor or the political leader. And, especially with the Jews, those political leader, religious leader, they went hand in hand. But here's what I want you to know in chapter number 3. It says, and he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing on his right hand to resist him. Now, get the picture. I think that this was more like a vision. We're looking beyond the physical, and we're looking into the spiritual. And here's Joshua, the high priest, and what was he charged to do? The high priest had the charge of rebuilding that temple. And I guarantee you, if the high priest is too discouraged and too fearful to do the job, the people aren't going to rally behind him. So here's Joshua the high priest, and who is standing on his right hand to resist him? Satan is. So when you go back into the book of Ezra and you read about the different opposition, the different people, the government decrees and all that, who was really behind all that? Satan was. Satan was on his right hand to resist him. In verse 2, and the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan. And this is something that we're going to learn a little bit as we go through the week. Satan does not have as much power as we would like to give him credit for. He has a lot of power with the unsaved. He has a lot of power with those that don't know the Lord. But if you're saved today, you're not in his kingdom. You've been translated from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his dear Son. You know, you go to places like Fiji and, witchcraft and demon possession and all that kind of stuff is way more open than it would maybe be in a culture like here in Australia. And some people get kind of uncomfortable with it, but you know, you do see a lot more of this open satanic possession and different stuff like that, and sometimes Christians get freaked out. And I say to them, why are you freaked out? No, it's just, I had one preacher preaching for us, and he'd heard some Fijian guys talking about something, about a demon-possessed person and this and that, and that preacher, he said, man, if I see a spook walking in this place right now, he said, I'm going right out that door. Of course, there was no door over there. And he said, you might be wondering which door. He said, the door I'm going to make when I run right through that wall. But for a Christian, there is absolutely nothing to be fearful of. Do you understand the power you have? Submit yourselves therefore unto God, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. It didn't say resist the devil and he'll flee from you. It said submit yourselves therefore unto God, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Satan's not really afraid of you, but he is very afraid of the one who has more power than you, which is God. And as long as you're submitted unto God, Satan, the gates of hell shall not prevail. There is no power to stop the advance of the Lord's people and of his church when it moves forward. There's nothing that can stop us. The gates of hell. The first time I heard that phrase, the gates of hell, in my mind, I heard the word gates of hell, but in my mind I saw gates of the church. And when I heard this thing, the gates of hell, for some reason in my mind I pictured the church inside the gates. And Satan is attacking the gates. And the gates are holding strong. Satan's attacking, but the gates are holding strong. Until I realized they're not called the gates of the church. They're called the gates of hell, not the gates of the church. It's not hell attacking the church, it's the church attacking hell. And those gates are everywhere. Wherever you're going to go, wherever you're going to take the gospel, Satan already beat you there. There's already a religion there. There's already a culture there. There's already a system there that has kept those people in bondage and darkness. And whenever you go into that place, the type of religions that Satan makes are ones that have all kinds of obligations that become cultural. So that even once people get saved, they still hold to their culture, which is often rooted in that pagan religion, and it becomes a constant stumbling block to biblical Christian living. So those are gates that Satan has built. Why do you build gates? To keep the people in from getting out and to keep the people out from getting in. But what did the Bible say about the gates of hell? They shall not prevail. You understand the promise we have? No matter where we go in the world, God might call you into Iran. God might call you into Afghanistan. I knew a missionary years ago. His name was Dean McLean. Did you ever know Dean McLean? I don't even know if he's still alive. He preached for me in Fiji years and years ago. But he was a missionary in Iran, but it was at an American base. And he said that the Lord put on his heart to drive up into Afghanistan. And at that time it was completely illegal, still under Taliban rule. Missionaries aren't allowed to go in there. And he felt the Lord tell him to drive up into Afghanistan and to take a box of Bibles in, I guess, Farsi or whatever the language is. So what he did, he put a box of Bibles in the boot of his car, and he drove to the border, knowing that the border patrol would check. And he just had such peace that the Lord had told him to do it. So he got up to the border, and at the checkpoint, they came in, and they opened his trunk. And he said, I had all kinds of stuff in the boot of my car. And he said, the box of Bibles was right on top. I didn't even try to hide it. And he said they looked on the one side, they opened the suitcase over there, they looked on the other side, they checked in that, they moved everything. He said, but they never even touched the box of Bibles that was right on top. He said, I don't know if they just thought nobody would be stupid enough to hide something on top, so why bother, or if the Lord just blinded them to what was there. So he said he was allowed in. He drove for a while until he came to a hotel, and he had a Bible in his bag. And when he went to check into his hotel, there was a Muslim woman in the full garb that was there, and nobody else was in there except he and her. So as he's checking in, he felt impressed of the Lord to just ask that lady, I'm a Christian, I'm a missionary, and I've got a Bible here, and I wondered if you would like a Bible. And he said that lady began to weep and just wipe her tears away. And she said 2 weeks earlier, another Christian of some sort had come through there and talked with her about the Lord, and she received Jesus Christ. And he told that lady, he said, I've got to go. I don't even have a Bible to leave with you. He said, but if you'll pray for it, God will bring a Bible to you. And 2 weeks later, here comes Dean McLean with this Bible. Do you understand that it doesn't matter how many gates a government, a lost people put up? If God calls you to go to that place, you're going through those gates. And that's what makes missions so exciting, is that you go armed with a whole bunch of promises. What did the Jews here forget? That they were armed with certain promises. They got intimidated and they stopped. So now we see Satan standing here to resist him. And who rebukes Satan? The Lord does. You don't have to worry about rebuking Satan. As long as you are doing what God asks you to do, you know that you're in the will of God and you're pursuing it. It actually doesn't matter what Satan puts in front of you. The Lord is going to rebuke that. The Lord is going to put open doors in front of you that nobody can shut. And He's going to open doors that would be impossible any other way. Let me just give you another example of this. When God called me to go to Fiji, I didn't know anything about visas. I didn't even know what a visa was. I had gone to Fiji on a summer mission trip, and we just went on our passport. You get an automatic 4-month visa. So when God called me to go back to Fiji, I bought a one-way ticket to Fiji. I didn't apply for a work permit. I now know in Fiji you have to have a work permit. You have to apply for that work permit before you come into the country. You're not allowed to fly into Fiji on a one-way ticket. They'll stop you at LA if you don't have a return ticket or a visa. So I visited Fiji on a mission trip June of 95. In December of 95, I was on my way back to Fiji with a one-way ticket. So I got into LAX with my one-way ticket. And of course, I don't realize what's happened until years later. Because years later, I'm reflecting, I'm going, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't supposed to happen. She never asked me for a return ticket. She never asked me if I had a visa or anything. I just put my one-way ticket there and thank you, sir. And so on I went onto the plane. I landed in Fiji, and as I'm going through immigration, the immigration officer asks me, and he says, oh, so what are you doing in Fiji? And I said, I came to preach. That was my words. I came to preach. And so he said, he looked into my passport, he said, do you have a work permit? And I said, a what? And he said, a work permit. And I said, no, I don't even know what that is. He said, you can't just come into our country and preach. You have to have a work permit. Now, what he could have done and what he should have done was refuse my entry and put me on the next plane back. But he said to me, all right, I'm going to stamp your passport. You have 14 days. You get to Suva, you have to get a work permit or you have to leave in 14 days. So on I go, I meet the pastor there, and I said, well, we have to do this. So anyway, we go down, we lodge all the documents for a work permit. Pastor Save, the Fijian pastor I worked under, his wife got very ill. She was an American. They returned to the States, and he handed his church to me and said, you have to pastor this church for the next 3 months. So after he flew out of the country, a couple weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from immigration. It was written to him as the pastor of the church. But the letter said this, Dear Pastor Save, please tell Kory Mears to leave the country and apply for his work permit from America, because you're actually not allowed to apply for that from within the country. And we need you to come down. Well, there's a couple big problems here. Number one, I only had enough money for a one-way ticket. I had no way to get another ticket to get out of the country. And Pastor Savi himself was in America. And that morning I'd been having my devotions where Sennacherib had come up and written the letter, to Hezekiah about what he was going to do. And Hezekiah took the letter and he spread it before the Lord. So I had that letter, so I just went down to the altar and I spread it before the Lord and I said, God, what do I do? Well, the 2 weeks prior to that, there had been a visitor coming to our church service. I didn't know who he was, but he was the minister for finance in the Fiji government, Fiji's very first self-made millionaire. And it's funny because the first Sunday he came, I preached on rich people. And I was, when you're young, preacher, you're just zealous. You rich people think you are. I let rich. And after the service, they told me who he was. And I said, thank God you didn't tell me before, because I probably would have compromised the message. I don't think I would have been able to do it. But after I got that letter, the next Sunday, this man, Jim Akoy, he just retired from politics. He was Fiji's ambassador to China, his last post. He walks up to me after the service, and he says, Kory, can I ask you a question? I said, yes, sir. He said, do you have a work permit? And I said, no, sir. And he said, I don't know why he'd asked me that question. I said, no, sir. He said, why not? I said, well, we applied for one, but I just got this letter from from immigration. He said, can I see the letter? He got the letter. He said, just give it to me. And he walked away. The next Sunday, he didn't come to church, but after the morning service, he showed up in his government vehicle, walked up to me and said, Kory, go down to immigration. Your work permit is waiting for you down there. Shook my hand, left, never came to church again. But now think of that. Think of, and I'm not recommending you follow my lead, but I literally had no idea what immigration laws were. I just, in my complete ignorance, went, and what did God do? Yeah. Do you know who your God is? Do you know him yet? Have you met him? You say, you're a missionary. God does those kind of things for missionaries. He doesn't do it to ordinary people like us. Well, obviously you haven't met him enough yet, because he's no respecter of persons. And the truth is, we all have a role to play. And this is what God is going to do. God is not going to lead you to something that you are capable of. Because if God did that, it'd rest too much in your hands. God typically leads you to something that is beyond your capability, that is going to require faith, it's going to require dependence, and God isn't going to fail. It's not in his nature. God doesn't fail. If he says it in the Bible, he's going to do it. He's going to keep his word. But it takes us a while to get to know God like this. And I failed God many times because of my doubt, and then God would come through and say, see, I told you that's who I am. And then once you get to know who this God is and you realize how powerful his word is, in fact, this is what he's going to tell Joshua here. In verse number 3 of chapter 3, now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, take away the filthy garments from him. Now, probably, this is just my thoughts, those filthy garments, again, he's using something visual to reflect what was really going on. His disobedience, his fear of man, his compromising and settling for the foundation. These filthy garments clothing this priest. Because he said, take away from him the filthy garments, and he said unto him, behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee. So those filthy garments are symbolizing the iniquity of the high priest. And he said, and I will clothe thee with a change of raiments. And I said, let them set a fair mitre upon his head. So they set a fair mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord stood by. Now in chapter 3, verse 1, we see Satan standing on his right hand, and now we see the angel of the Lord standing by him. All right, this signifies that everything that God is going to ask us to do is going to be empowered by God himself. What we do is going to be beyond us. It's not going to even be what we do. The longer you do this and the more you walk with the Lord, the more you feel like you're on this journey observing the great things that God is doing. It's not the great things that you're doing. It is the great things that God is doing through you, amongst you, and with you. So now we see the angel of the Lord standing by. Verse 6. And the angel of the Lord protested unto Joshua, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts. Now you got the word if. As I heard it said when I was a young Christian, the biggest little word in the English language. If. 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 So many things you don't see in your life are not because God doesn't want to bless you, not because God doesn't want to use you, not because God has forgotten about you. It's because you have not met the condition of the if. You made a choice. We make choices every day. The sum total of your life is usually the result of the decisions that you have made. You have to make decisions. God isn't going to override your will. Your power will not be enough, but God will require your willingness along the way. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, if thou will walk in my ways, and if thou will keep my charge. There are two things he's required to do. He was required to walk in his ways and to keep his charge. When you talk about walking in his ways, that is what you are. When you talk about keeping his charge, that is what you do. His ways are how you live. It's your life. It's your holiness. It's the lifestyle. The charge is the commission, the work that he gives you to do. What I am and what I do, both of them are important. I know some Christians, they really focus on living right, being right, doing right, but they don't actually do something. There are others who are doing many things for the Lord, but they're not being what God wants them to be. He said, if you will do these two things, notice this. Then thou shalt judge my house, and shalt also keep my courts. That means the temple would be built. God said, you see what I'll do. Now notice this last phrase. And I will give thee places to walk among these that stand by. Powerful statement. Joshua, there are a lot of people who will spend their entire life standing by. When I think of that phrase, stand by, it could be someone who's intentionally standing by, observing. It can also refer to someone who is on standby. You know what that means? I'll call you when I'm ready for you, but just stand by for now. Do you understand that God really does want to use you, that nobody's born to be on standby? That's not why God made you. But if you don't walk in his ways, and if you're not willing to keep his charge, that's how you'll spend your life as a Christian, on standby. How do you know if you've been on standby? Well, because when you get to that point of your life, when you stand back and think to yourself, has the Lord utilized me for anything of eternal value? If this life was over and I was in heaven, where will I be able to look in heaven and see that what I did on this earth has made an actual eternal impact anywhere? And if you've been on standby, you're going to be hard-pressed to find anything. When you're not on standby, what is God doing? He is giving you places to walk among these that stand by. And people won't understand it. They'll think, why does the Lord use you and He doesn't use me? But it's not really about you. It's all what the Lord's doing. But we have two things to do. Two things. To walk in His ways and to keep His charge. What should Joshua have been doing for the last 17 years? He should have been building that temple. But what was he doing? He was on standby. Everybody else was on standby. And I suppose I think about it this way. When this life is said and done, and it's all over, and I'm sitting in heaven because I'm saved, will I have lived a life on standby? Or will I have lived a life where God gave me places to walk amongst those that stood by? When I left to the mission field, there were 17 young people in my church. 17. We were in the youth group together. We sang in the youth choir together. We taught Sunday school together. We worked on buses. I heard you talking about a bus route. We worked on buses together. Every Saturday we would go out visiting neighborhoods, bringing kids in. Do you know of those 17 young people that I was in church with, only one of them even goes to church today? Just one. And I remember their decisions when it came to walking in His ways. I remember that. Because I remember they were trying to tell me, oh, Kory, come on, you're being too, holy. Come on, you got to have a little bit of fun. I remember the pressure they gave me. You know what? They're not around anymore. And it really hurts when I think about it. So, as we prepare for the missions conference, I am positive that there are two clear things that God will do to you this week. One, God may make it very clear and very evident where you are not walking in His ways. It's very easy for us to recognize where we are walking in His ways, and we like to focus on that, but we need to hear honestly from the Lord when God says, this has got to stop and that's got to stop. Because if you keep giving excuses for those things, you're going to be on standby. All those things that God gets rid out of your life, it's not just because God doesn't like you and God's trying to steal your fun from you. It's that those things will be a hindrance when He gives you His charge. So you got to let the Lord change the things in your life that He's working on. The second thing that God will do is He wants to tell you His charge. I have found often when we are saying, God, what's your will for my life? God, what do you want me to do for my life? And God said, I'm not giving you the charge yet. I'm not giving you the charge because you're not walking in my ways yet. So I can't tell you the charge yet. You've got to be on standby. And if you've been seeking and God's not talking, it's not because God doesn't know yet. It's not because God's still thinking about it. You know, in that great song, Nothing Between My Soul and the Savior. And what would be really sad is if God still couldn't give you direction this week because you still have those things between you and the Lord, and God's going to have to keep you on standby until you let Him really work in your life. So this would be my humble request to you. Do you genuinely want the Lord to talk to you this week? I will tell you a bit more of my story because it's not my story, it's the Lord's story. God has only proven to me over 23 years of what kind of a God He is, and I want men and women and young people to know that I don't care what God calls you to do, this is what He can do. And if He's not a respecter of person, so He'll use me, He'll use you, He'll use anybody. I want you to be excited about what God may be doing and may be calling you to. But it would be too bad if God said, nah, you have ears, but you don't get to hear this week. So I would encourage you, when you go home tonight, and you wake up in the morning, with all of your heart, say, God, I am listening. I am listening. It could be that it won't be anything I've preached. Perhaps even now. There are already things the Holy Spirit has been dealing in your heart. And you know where you've been, that little wall of resistance. And you know what it is because the Holy Spirit's talking to you about it right now. How about you stop making the 17-year-long excuses like Israel made and pushing that off? Why don't we let God deal with it now? And you might be amazed what God would speak to you this week. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me, please? Lord, I thank you for this evening. I thank you, Lord, for this group of believers. And I am most thankful, Lord, that no generation on this earth has been left without a witness. Sometimes the witness has grown dim. Other times it's been bright. But Lord, you have not failed to raise up laborers in every generation. And Lord, within this congregation here, only you know what your plan is with each man and each woman that's here. It's just sad to think that some may spend their whole life on standby. So Lord, may you give each believer here tonight a fresh determination to seek God and to hear His voice. And may each person be sensitive and submissive to the Lord. And may you speak clearly to your people, to your church. And he that hath ears, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the church. Amen.